Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and this lesson is dedicated to further mating patterns and defenses against checkmate. So today we're mainly focused on the cases when to checkmate opponent's king, you need to perform some preparation, mainly of the tactical kind. So in this given position, we can notice that white is in the attack against black's king. So black's king is exposed, it is not castled, it has no right to castle anymore in this game, and it is quite exposed to white's attacking pieces. So we can see that white has quite a lot of active pieces. So the queen, the knight, the rook, they are all ready to attack the king. Standard checkmating patterns don't work, at least immediately here, because if queen, let's say, goes to d8 square, at first glance it is a checkmate. In fact, black's rook d2 controls d8 square, so the rook simply captures the queen and white loses. So at the same time, we can notice another interesting possibility of a check on e7, but in this case, after queen e7, the king goes to g8, and we can see that h6 ensures the safety of the king. So after the further checks, the king simply hides on h7. So white is still probably better, but it is definitely not a checkmate. So what to do here to prevent the king's escape? Rook to e8. So it is another check, and by the way, in such a position, when it is full of tactics, it is very sharp. You have to consider all possible checks. In this case, this check simply decides, because, well, the king has no chance to go away. It has to take the rook, and after this capture, we can see that queen e7 leads to a checkmate. By the way, another typical checkmating pattern, so the queen is supported by the knight and controls all possible squares that king could have occupied. In this position, black has serious material advantage, the extra rook, but there is a serious drawback. The king occupies very odd position on c5. It is completely limited by own pieces and white's pieces, so it is a typical sign of a possible checkmate. But at the moment, all critical squares are controlled. So for example, d5 square is controlled by black's pieces, so it is not possible to play simply rook d5 with the checkmate. If, let's say, knight b4 jumps to d3, then first of all it closes the rook, so the king has the d file to go away, and this square is also controlled by the bishop, so bishop simply can capture the knight. And also square d6, which is very tempting to occupy with the queen, is controlled by the knight from b5, so it is not possible to go there. At the same time, we can notice that if the knight b4 goes to a6 square, it will be also a very nice check. But at the moment, this square is engaged by the own queen. So there is an interesting idea of just going away with the queen somewhere so that giving the knight the chance to occupy a6 with check. But it doesn't mean that every move with the queen works. For example, if queen goes to c8, then rook takes. And if knight goes to a6 check, the king, as we can see, has a chance to go to c6 square. So here we have the idea of controlling the c6 square prior to occupying a6 with the knight. So queen goes exactly to c6, very powerful move. So now when bishop or pawn takes on c6, this square is engaged so that the own pawn, the own piece prevents the king from moving to this square, and knight goes to a6 with check, and it is a checkmate because all possible squares where the king could have moved are controlled by either white's pieces or engaged by black's pieces. So it is a common motive which is very important to memorize, so you actually clear the way for the knight or any other piece to attack opponent's king, and actually at the same time you prevent the escape of the king by forcing your opponent to occupy important squares. Another interesting position, we can see that again white is in the attack, the rook already controls the open h file, but unfortunately it is not possible to use this file immediately because the king simply controls h8 square. At the same time, we can notice the knight on f5, it is very close to the king. It controls g7 and e7 squares. e7 is probably the most important one, so that if, let's say, king goes to f8, then rook h8 will be a checkmate because the knight simply controls the square of escape. And the queen, which is at first glance far away from the king side, but at the same time it has the access to some squares controlling diagonal a3, f8. So first of all, queen goes to f8. Nice sacrifice, and it appears that doesn't really matter with which piece black takes the queen, he loses. So if king takes f8, then rook goes to h8. We already discussed this possibility. So the rook attacks the king along the back rank. Pawns prevent the king from escaping, and another square on the 7th rank is controlled by the knight, another typical pattern. And if rook takes on f8, in this case we deal with another great pattern, so knight goes to e7. It is check, and since the rook controls the h file, it is not possible to go away to the h file, and all other squares are engaged with own pieces. So it is one of the versions of the so-called smothered mate, a very important pattern to memorize. This example is a bit more sophisticated, but still very, very important to understand and to memorize the pattern. So we can immediately notice the h file, which is open, and the rook is on h6, so that h8 square is empty, and another rook can join the one on h6 in the attack along the h file. So the problem with the immediate move rook to h8, which creates some strong threats. The main one is to play rook to h1, and when the king goes to g2, another rook jumps to h2, so that it will be a checkmate, because pawn g4 controls f3 square so that the king can't escape. So this is parried by knight takes g4 move. Of course, there is a possibility of playing rook to h1, but after king g2, black simply has no follow-up. Because, first of all, there is no longer a pawn controlling f3 square, so in any case the king can go away through f3. And on the other hand, the knight g4 controls h2 square, so that preventing this check in general. So in the initial position, prior to doing all this, black prepares the attack by sacrificing the queen. So queen takes the knight, pawn takes the queen, otherwise black simply has decisive material advantage. And now rook goes to h8. So the pattern is almost complete. So the pawn controls f3 square. For example, if white makes the move like, let's say, rook to e1, then black checks the king from h1, and then after king goes to g2, another rook goes to h2. So the one rook controls the back rank, the first rank in this case, another rook controls the second rank and attacks the king, and the pawn g4 prevents king from getting to f3 square, while g3 pawn, the own pawn, engages also theoretically possible square of going away. So very good checkmate. But what happens if, let's say, white pushes the f-pawn trying to escape through f2? So f3 or f4 doesn't really matter in this case. We can notice f2 square. So now to complete the pattern and to checkmate opponent's king, black has to control this square. So bishop goes to c5 with check. It is a tempo move, controlling very important f2 square. And if rook f2, then rook h1, king g2, and another rook to h2. So as we can see, in many cases, when we have the pattern almost completed, we still have to make some preparation. And in many cases, when your position is strong enough, this sort of preparation means some sacrifices. So you prepare everything to make your pattern work. Now we go to defending patterns. So we can see that in this position, black is at first glance in trouble because white has extremely active pieces. The queen, the rook, and the bishop all attack g7. So there is a threat of just taking on g7 with the checkmate. By the way, it is possible to take not only with the queen, but also with the rook. It will be still a checkmate. We can notice that the pin along the g file prevents black from taking the queen on h6, and this pin is based on the position of the rook on g3. So if there is no rook on g3, black simply captures the queen. So to do this, black actually has to eliminate the rook, and in this situation it is possible with the help of queen takes g3. So a very strong move. Queen captures the rook that pins g-pawn, at the same time protecting g7, so it is not possible to play queen takes g7 with a checkmate. And if pawn takes queen, then black also takes the queen and wins the game. Very important defending pattern to memorize. In this position, we can notice that there is a threat of a checkmate on g7, and black simply has no normal means to prevent this checkmate. The king can't escape. In this situation, it is possible to simplify a position, so to eliminate one of the attacking pieces with the help of nice combination. So everything starts with queen h2 check. This forces white, of course, to take the queen. Queen is captured, but now black continues with the knight g4 check, and it is fork. So after king goes away, it is, by the way, the only way to protect the king here. So king goes away, knight takes f6, eliminating the queen, and black is out of danger. Another dangerous position for black, because there is a threat of rook h8 checkmate. It is not possible to prevent this check at first glance, and at the same time the king can't escape by simply running away, because in this case rook anyway goes to h8. We can notice that pawn f6 simply controls g7 and e7 squares, so that preventing king from moving there. So in this case, there is a possibility to break the connection between the queen and the rook with the help of rook h4 move. At first glance, it looks like a stupid idea because the rook can be simply captured. In fact, after rook goes away from c4 square, we can notice that black has the working tandem of the bishop and the queen, and actually black creates a threat of a checkmate as well. So if rook takes h4, then queen f1 checkmate. If queen takes h4, the same, queen to f1 checkmate. So here, after rook h4, white has actually the only move, the only normal defense to prevent checkmate on f1. It is queen to d3, after which there is no longer a checkmate threat on h8, and black can capture the queen, then capture the rook, the total exchange. And after bishop takes d3, this endgame should be drawish. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you next lessons.